but I will be
Okay.
done pre-flowing very shortly. So I'll, I guess, begin soon.
Okay, well, just let me know when you're ready. Our other entry, do you need time to pre-flow and everything too?
No, I'm all good.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sounds good. So just let us know when you're ready, and then we'll begin when you're ready. Okay. Oh, I should probably confirm sides too. So, all right. So the affirmative is CR North. All right. Oh, that's you. I realized they put labels on, so just give me a second. And then, how do you say that? Rigby?
Yeah, it's Rigby.
Okay, Rigby. Cool. And then you're the neg side, correct? Okay, sounds good. Right. All right. And before I forget, I do apologize. I have 2 cats, and I will try to push them off as much as possible, and so forth. So if you see a cat or a cat butt, I'm so sorry. So I
Okay,
do
I think that's more of a
apologize.
benefit, honestly.
So
All right, cool. So I just finished pre-flowing. Let me just get a timer out for 6 minutes. Judge ready? Opponent all good? All right, in that case.
just give me 1 second. All
Oh,
right.
yeah, of
I
course.
need to get my note sheet up and so forth. And then I just need to check on times. And what is your prep period for if
It's
you
4
need?
minutes.
Okay, 4
Yeah.
minutes. All right. Just thought I would double check. All right. Now I just need to get timer. Oh, good. They did give me a time. All right. Sounds good. And overall, 6 minutes. All right. I'm ready when you are.
All right, in that case, I'm going to begin on my first word. I firmly resolve that a just government ought to recognize the unconditional right of workers to strike. Before I begin, I would like to offer some definitions from Merriam-Webster. Just is act or being in conformity with what is morally right or good, ought, a moral obligation or duty, recognized to accept or approve of having legal authority. Unconditional is not conditioned or limited, and union is a organization of workers formed to protect the rights and interests of its members. The value of this round will be justice. Justice means giving Andrea et al. 18. Justice means giving each person his or her due. When society's members come to feel that they're subject to unequal treatment, foundations have been laid for social unrest and strife. The value criterion is minimizing structural violence. Winter in late 99. Our normal cognitive and processing groups divide people into in-groups and out-groups. Those outside of our group lie outside of our scope of justice, and those who fall outside are morally excluded and demeaned in some way so that we do not have to acknowledge the injustices they suffer. But this is not inevitable if we become aware of the operations and build ways to mitigate its effects. Patau 01. Our morals apply to the people we value, which is defined as inside of our scope of justice, and we extend considerations and share resources with them. We see other kinds of people as being enemies or strangers outside of our moral scope of justice, and they are excluded. We have to prefer the value and value criterion of justice and minimizing structural violence, because if we do not extend justice to these marginalized groups, there is no justice. Conditions are created by the ruling body, the in-group as outlined by Patau 01, and conditions will inherently disincentivize the out-group, the oppressed who seeks a way to escape unsafe conditions, low wages, etc. And the only way to achieve justice is to recognize unconditional unconditional strikes would truly represent the opinions of the oppressed body. Contention 1. Conditions disincentivizes strikes, so recognition of unconditional strikes is vital to uplift suppressed voices, particularly in the current political climate. Unions are declining across the world, weakening their ability to negotiate worker benefits and protections. Visor 19. If the rate of membership decline continues, at the end of the decade, unions will represent fewer percent of Australian workforce, with most membership concentrated in fewer industries. Unionism in France is condemned either to resign into playing a marginal role or managing ever smaller fringes of the public and administrative sector, and labor unions in the United States are back to where they were before 1930. We can also see that the conditions limit the circumstances in which workers can strike, or they can mitigate the amount of protection a striking worker may receive in the case of an unlawful strike, in general disincentivizing them. Lexology 14, the UK ban on secondary strikes. April 14th, the European Court of Human Rights held the ban on secondary strikes or sympathy strikes adopted by the UK did not violate the right to freedom of association guaranteed by Article 11 by the Human Rights Convention. So we see that banning secondary strikes is an example of these conditions in which workers can't really truly voice their concerns. Contention 2, strikes uplift Black workers. Black workers are overrepresented at the lowest paying jobs, and their ability to unionize have been aggressively challenged by companies such as Amazon. Perry et al. 21. Black workers are overrepresented among risky essential jobs like Amazon's warehouse on the COVID-19 frontlines, especially among frontline jobs that pay less than livable wage. Black workers comprise 27% of Amazon workforce compared to just 13% of workers overall in the US. In Amazon's Bessemer's warehouse, and union organizers estimate that 85% of the workers are Black. Richardson particularly voiced his frustration about dehumanizing nature of his work, including unrelenting pace, risk of being terminated at any point, and the constant surveillance. You don't even get treated like a person, he claimed. Amazon's aggressive anti-union tactics have garnered headlines and illustrate the daunting challenge of uneven playing field facing organized efforts in all workplaces. And the decline of union participation, only about 10% of American workers are currently a member of one. ELK 20, how Black and Brown workers are redefining strikes in the digital age. On Friday, Juneteenth 19, the Movement for Black Lives Matter asked thousands of workers to take off work and attend rallies and protests in honor of making Juneteenth a federal holiday. For the first time ever, scientists, many employed by academic research laboratories, went out on their first mass nationwide strike, demanding that their employees meet to address issues of racial inequality in the workplace as a result of a non-traditional work stoppage. Striking is a positive mechanism for change, and any conditions put in place to disincentivize a move to a more equal society suppresses the minority voice. Contention 3, strikes push back against class discrimination. Strikes can push back against monopoly power to ensure workers see the benefits of production. Bond 19. Strikes play an important role in empowering workers vis-a-vis their employer. By withdrawing their labor power, workers are able to balance the scales against owners of capital who rely on workers for production and providing services. Strikes have declined in frequency, popularity, and success over the past 4 decades, yet today, amid rising economic inequalities, they are once again becoming an important tool in exercising worker power to ensure that gains of probability and economic growth can be broadly shared. At the same time, there's an increased consensus today that unions are a positive force for increasing worker power and balancing against economic inequality. The pull of support for unions in specific aspects of collective bargaining, and strikes have historically been one of the strongest tools used to ensure that unions have power to engage in collective bargaining. Monopoly power is a situation in the labor market where individual employers exercise effective control over wage setting rather than wage being set by competitive forces. In a working paper by Mark Paul of New College of Florida, the roles of collecting action in offsetting employer monopoly power is examined in the context of institutional support for labor. The unions can serve as a countervailing power against employer power, and the model shows that institutional support for labor for unions, such as legislation protecting the right to organize, is essential for the dynamic process of balance of employers' monopoly power. Nabisco serves as a case study to show the success of strikes in improving pay benefits. VidGore 21. Members of the bakery objected to changes in shift lengths and overtime ruling. The strike has brought about renewed attention to the giant snack, which faced criticism from union members over long shifts, pension, and production. Workers in Colorado, Virginia, and Illinois followed suit with the strike after it occurred, and more than 1,000 Nabisco employees take part in the strike, the union estimated. We see that they would get premium on those weekend shifts. Moldeves, previously eligible for extra pay, would get premium only after working 40 hours. Those weekend shifts would most likely be filed by newer employees under the terms of agreement, according to the contract photos posted online. Worker strikes have also improved protection for laborers and strengthened their confidence and ability to mobilize in the future. So because we see that through the affirmative unconditional strikes, we are best upholding minimizing structural violence and justice, I urge you to vote in the affirmative. Thank you. And I also stand ready for cross-ex.
All right. Is our judge ready?
Give me 1 second to reset my timer.
All right.
All right, and this is the 3 minutes, so let me get that started. All right. Okay, I'm good now.
Is my opponent?
Yep.
All right, then with that, let's begin. So first off, just a bit of housekeeping. Your value was that of justice for the criterion of minimizing violence?
Minimizing structural violence.
Structural violence. Okay. And your contention 1 was that the conditions harm workers. Contention 2 was about Black workers. And what was your tagline for your contention 3?
Let me reread it. Strikes push back against class discrimination, essentially ensuring that the strikes push back against the overarching like company power, allows them to have like collective bargaining rights and things like that.
Okay. Would you agree that strikes exist in both worlds, both the affirmative and the negative?
Yeah, so in the status quo, I do agree that they exist. However, there are many regulations. For instance, I know there's one where it's like you have to give like a 72-hour notice of the strike before a lockdown commences, or like the majority of those voting must agree. There's a lot of like stipulations currently put in place that disincentivizes strikes.
Question about that. You bring up the idea that like what was it? 2/3 have to vote for agreement. Isn't that in the union itself, not like the laws in place?
Yeah, so again, as I was saying, the conditions, I guess because it is a global resolve, you can't just look to the United States. You have to kind of look globally. Like I know in China, they don't even allow workers to strike. The workers rely on the companies in order to like maintain production. So it's because the conditions set in place are like by the governing body, and the governing body has no need essentially to like directly incentivize these strikes, nor would they want to. It
Okay.
ends up, I guess, they wouldn't strike even if they wanted to, or there might be a circumstance in which they're less likely to strike, that type of idea.
Okay. What are your main impacts in today's debate?
Gotcha. So condition incentivized strikes. So essentially, if you have an unconditional strike and you don't have any stipulations of what like must be met, you allow for a true representation of suppressed voices. That's like the overall, specifically with we see how like even secondary strikes, there's conditions on that. You wouldn't be able to voice your concerns. It uplifts Black workers. If you have less, if every just government recognized an unconditional right, they would be able to strike when they see fit, not when
Okay.
it is allowed, essentially.
Can you define justice in your own words?
Yeah. Do you want me to read the justice
No.
definition so that you have like an exact?
No, I have like an exact kind of definition. Like, what do you believe justice is?
Gotcha. So it's like basically giving each person their equal due.
Okay. So if you say it's giving each person what
And
they're
out
due,
to each person.
oh, okay. So if every person is getting what they're due, if strikes take away from what they're due, aren't they not just?
No, giving each person his or her due, like what they deserve as like
And if strikes
inherent
aren't
rights.
what they are deserved, isn't the strike unjust?
Do you mean, well, let's say for instance, like a coal miner is striking because he is given unfair wages or he's given like extremely long shifts. They would be upholding their own individual justices. They're fighting to have their due and to receive like an equally allocated whatever.
Right.
Yes, that's
All right,
how.
Yep, that's time. Good.
All right. I'd just like to take running prep starting now. All right, end prep time there. I used about a minute 40. For a brief off-time roadmap, I'm simply going to be reading the negative case, then attacking the affirmative. Is everyone ready? All right, then with that, I'll begin on my first word. I negate the following resolution resolved. A just government ought to recognize an unconditional right of workers to strike. In order to have clarity in today's round, I present the following definition. Unconditional is defined as not subject to conditions by Oxford Dictionary. As such, the paramount value in today's debate is that of justice, defined by Aristotle as giving each their due. This must be the preferred value for two reasons. One is the only lens that can objectively weigh morality, and second, it is universal, applying to all people equally. With this in mind, the best criterion to achieve justice is that of telos, which is defined as purpose. The purpose of going on strike in the first place is to guarantee certain rights and freedoms of citizens. If unconditional strikes cannot achieve this purpose, then they should not be upheld. Convention 1 is each their due. In the very act of removing all conditions on strikes, one opens the door for countless harms in the future, leading to the possibility of strikes harming the furthering of justice in the society. Subpoint A is that of freedoms. The specific unconditional right to strike can lead to strikes eroding on others' rights and freedoms. For examples, first off is the freedom of movement. According to CSCE, the right to movement is a fundamental human right. People have the right to move within their own country, and however, strikes can devastate that right. According to Crema in 2005, there have been strikes in many countries that have paralyzed transportation in both intra and international travel, halting the right to movement. Second is the right to life and health. In the process of making strikes unconditional, we run the risk of strikes in the healthcare system. According to Wright and 10, nurse strikes in New York increased mortality rates by nearly 20%. Certain conditions on strikes need to be maintained to protect those that need medical care. Third is right from undue violence. And by recognizing an unconditional right to strike, the government would be sanctioning violent strikes, which according to Tenza and 20, in just South Africa, there are nearly 200 deaths and 300 injuries. Judge, by recognizing this right, the government vouches for that behavior. Fourth is the right to education. According to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all have the fundamental right to an education. According to Baker, teacher strikes can significantly impact student test scores, even up to harming scores by nearly 30%. When teachers go on strike without certain parameters kept, we harm the future of society. Judge, the unconditional right to strike can harm others' rights in society, further harming justice and going against the very purpose of strikes. Subpoint B is economic impacts. While strikes do cause the employer to feel economic pressure, they can often cause undue harms in the society. Two examples. First off is in developing economies. According to Tenza in 2020, when the economy is stable, the quality of life increases. However, many strikes can lead to stagflation and overall harms on growth. Tenza continues with the example of South Africa. Strikes have cost the country nearly $20 billion since 2013, as well as weakening South African currency, lowering global investment, and harming overall productivity in the country. In developing countries, there needs to be limits on strikes in order to allow economic growth. Second is the loss of wages. The more strikes happen, the more wages drop, as well, including the loss of jobs. According to Schreiber in 19, GM has resorted to relying on outsourcing to other countries and a cadre of temporary workers. These have two main impacts. First off is unemployment. As economies stagnate, there's an increase in unemployment as employers can't afford as many employees. And second is poverty. As wages drop and unemployment rises, poverty and all the issues associated with poverty become more widespread. Judge, if you want to prevent this, vote for the side of negative. Judge, at the end of the day, strikes cannot be unconditional. They must be balanced with other social interests. Vote for the side that truly gives all what they are due, the side of the negative. With that, let's move on to attack my opponent's case. First off, on the value criterion debate. Now, we both agree that the value of justice is the most important in today's round. However, we disagree on the way that we achieve justice. We have to look towards telos because it actually sees why we're going on strike in the first place. If we're going on strike in the sense of promoting our rights, bettering these citizens' rights and these workers' rights, and that's the purpose it needs to achieve. If that purpose erodes on other people's rights, then it is a not just thing. It is violating justice. It's not making so everyone does not get what they are due. Second off, on my opponent's criterion of minimizing violence, this can actually be turned to the negative because look towards my contention 1 subpoint B about economy. If we allow strikes to be unconditional, it can lead to harms of economic growth, which leads to things such as unemployment and widespread poverty. Poverty leads to several things. It can harm test scores. It can increase structural violence. It can increase item after item, leading to furthering harms of justice in a society. Well, moving on to my opponent's contention 1 about the conditions are harmful. A couple of responses here. First off, the affirmative is fighting to protect all rights, not simply the workers' rights. My opponent brings up that these conditions can be bad for the actual right to strike inherently, that we have to put an unconditional right in order to make sure that everyone can go on strikes in the first place. However, laws and conditions can change, but what the negative is concerned with is about the purpose. If these strikes do not actually help achieve its purpose, if it's leading to furthering harms down the line, then we need to stop unconditional strikes. My opponent agreed in cross-examination that strikes are going to exist in both worlds. We will still have strikes in the world of the negative. However, we are not going to have unconditional strikes. We're going to balance the right to strike with other social interests. So moving on to his contention, my opponent's contention 2 about Black workers. A couple of responses here. First off, if you want to help those that are worse off in society, you have to help from the bottom line. You have to go through start trying to promote the economy. You need to try to increase unemployment and make sure that we don't have better wages. However, if you have an unconditional right to strike, that can actually lead to furthering harms on all these people, including Black workers, that my opponent is saying is actually unfairly represented in these lower income states. As you can see, that look toward the example of South Africa. They have strikes that are rampant, that are leading to furthering harms against economic growth. It's leading to stagflation, which is when consumer interest is dropping and inflation is rising, leading to more inflation is leading to more harms and leading just the overall economy just faltering. If you want to protect those that are worst off in society, going for Black workers as well as going into class discrimination, you need to promote the side that's actually protecting that, and that can only be the side of the negative. On my opponent's contention 3 about class discrimination, again, a few things you have to remember here, Judge, is that the negative is not advocating for an abolition of strikes. Strikes are still going to exist in the world of the negative. We are simply making sure that we balance that right. We're making sure that these unlimited strikes don't cause undue violence. We're making sure that these unlimited strikes don't harm healthcare workers. We're making sure these unlimited strikes don't harm people's education and the right to movement. At the end of the day, Judge, you have to pay attention to all of the rights. Now, the right to strike can be an important right by any means. However, if you put that right above all others, you're leading to further harms against justice. You're increasing violence. You're going against the very purpose of strikes. And at the end of the day, you're just leading to more harms throughout the whole society. And for all these reasons and many more, I urge you to vote for the negative and open myself up to cross-examination. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take running prep, but it's probably going to be like 30 seconds just to collect myself, and then I'll get into cross-ex, and I am starting that now. All right, I'm going to stop it there. It took me a sec to switch back, but I used an even 30 seconds. And then I am just going to begin the 3-minute cross on my first word. All right, so just to clarify, your value, justice, value criterion, was it telos, purpose? Telos, yes. Okay, gotcha. So with your first contention, when you're talking about how unconditional strike erode other rights, and they can like devastate the right to movement, the right to life, the right to education, etc. Yes. All of these erosions and negative impacts, are they happening right now? Like, was all of that evidence pulled from a conditional strike?
All this evidence is pulled from the right to strike. What the negative is saying is that if we don't have certain conditions on strikes, we can see more of this.
Okay, but are those problems currently happening?
Sometimes, yes. That's the issue, because the negative is taking the world as it is and saying if we put unconditional rights, we're allowing this to happen even more in the future. As right now,
oh, sorry, you can continue.
Right, because right now in the world, not all governments are just. There is laws in place that are not just. You brought up the example of China, and the whole point of this debate is seeing what we can do to increase justice. And in the case of the negative, we're saying that if you put unconditional strikes, it's going to harm it.
Okay, so do you have any examples, any links, or any way to show that this is going to increase in the negative world? Like the negative impacts that we currently see from strikes are going to increase?
Increase? Yes, simply by opening up the door to it. If you put laws in place and allow, like right now, for example, I brought up the example of nurse strikes. Specifically, right in 10, it brought up nurse strikes in New York, increased mortality rates by 20%. Right now, they have
on those nurse. I got that point. But building off of that, so when you're talking about nurse strikes and medical strikes, do medical workers not deserve the right to, for instance, normal hours, normal wages, better conditions? So what makes the consumers more important than the workers? Because in your case, you seem to be valuing the impacts on the consumers more than the people doing the jobs.
We are not doing that. So what we are saying is right now there are certain, they've put in certain conditions in certain areas on the right on healthcare workers. Things such as they have to notify, like I think it was like 75 days in advance. That way they can make sure that all these workers and these patients can be cared for. There's certain conditions, not saying that they can't go on strike. We are saying that those conditions have to be upheld. That way we can help promote it. I brought the example of educators. We need to make, in certain areas that people have just gone on strike, and that's led to further harms, even though it wasn't necessarily a lawful strike. But those teachers going on strike actually led to harming test scores. So if there's conditions.
So basically you're saying that like we need to have conditions. Also, what stipulates these conditions, and how do you guarantee that those conditions are always going to be like not disincentivizing whatever group wants to strike?
That's the whole point of a just government and a democracy, is to help fight for those correct laws. What the negative is saying is that if you just put
So are you saying that our government is inherently just?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that's the point of our government. The principles that we're built on is built to help fight for those just ideals.
Okay, and that's time. I'm gonna take running prep. I'm probably gonna use around 2:30, but which is an estimate, and I'm starting that now. All right, so that was 250. And let me pull up my flow. So I'm going to be beginning on my opponent's case first, and I'm kind of just gonna, well, I'll first start by addressing, off-time roadmap. I'm gonna begin by addressing the value-valid criterion, that whole thing, and just generals for the whole round, and then I'm going to be going down my opponent's contentions and then circling back to my own case. All right, cool.
All right. Before you get there, Affirmative, what do you have left for remaining time?
I used 30 initially and then 250. So I'd have like a minute something left.
All right. With 4 minutes total prep time?
Yeah, 4 minutes total prep time.
Okay. And then, Rigby, what do you have for left for prep?
I've used 1:40, so I should have about 2:20 left.
Okay. All right. I was just double checking my numbers on my side.
Mm-hmm.
But Affirmative, you are welcome to begin. Thank you for that.
Yeah. All right, cool. In that case, I will begin on my first word for that 4-minute speech. So starting off, we are both valuing justice. So that's giving each their own due. We've established that. Moving on to how we are getting to justice. Judge, my opponent is using telos, essentially looking to purpose and like what are these effects of these strikes and how are they impacting the economy. But the only viable way to truly achieve justice is minimizing structural violence, as I've provided evidence in my case to support. Essentially, because we have these in-groups and out-groups in our cognitive processes, those who fall outside are always going to be morally excluded in any governing body, just or not just. He brought up a democracy. Even the United States has so many basically integral structural violences in which, you know, Black workers are historically been underrepresented, Black women have historically been underrepresented. No government is ever truly going to be just. That is simply just not a logical way to argue this. So we just have to look at what we define as an in-group and an out-group. The only moral framing that accounts for the rights and the needs and the wants of the out-group and the minority voice is my case and the way that we have valued minimizing structural violence. If you value criterion of minimizing structural violence, if you're weighing this with telos, you are essentially going to be disregarding that minority group. And you won't be able to minimize structural violence and bring in this out-group. Also, all of the examples that my opponent has provided are taken from the status quo. All of these were conditional strikes that are happening right now, and all of the negatives and the bad impacts he's saying persist in the negative world and will continue to persist in the negative world. However, the only difference between the two would be that my opponent is saying that, like, in the affirmative, they would be extrapolated because they are unconditional, but doesn't provide any evidence or any framing links or any actual way to prove that it's actually going to be worse. Striking can be definitely recognized as a kind of last resort for many workers when they're in horrible conditions. And the strikers are not going to go on strike simply because they like striking. They rely on their jobs, and they rely on their jobs for their well-being and their pay and their living. So it's not just going to suddenly everyone is just going to start striking just because. It'll only be because if there's something that they need from their employers, which the conditions put on it disincentivize those. Moving on to my opponent's first contention, giving each their due, how there's countless harms in the future. Again, there's no evidence or proof that unconditional strikes mean more harm, because all of these examples are from the status quo and the strikes are currently happening. Also, we need to think about the actual workers behind these strikes, the people that are being oppressed. Why are people going on strikes in the first place? Typically, it's because there's stresses put on them, or they're given unfair wages, or they're given unfair dues, or they're being subject to conditions that aren't livable. For instance, the Amazon example that I brought up, or factory workers. So there's a reason that these people are striking. By only valuing the right to life and the right to health and the right of education, you're disregarding the right of the teachers themselves to strike when they see fit, and to strike when they realize that their rights are not being upheld. So the only way to bring in this outgroup is to allow unconditional strikes. Because this is a global debate, you can't define that a just government is only going to stipulate conditions that are like perfectly balance everything. A lot of conditions are stipulated in order to control strikes and either to disincentivize them or minimize them. For instance, like 42 hours notice before a strike or lockdown, lrb.gov. And there's also a majority of those voting must agree with the strike or lockout by the labor board supervised strike vote for unions or lockout polls, both from the same source. So there are things in place currently that are going to disincentivize people from striking and make it more difficult for strikes to happen. And unconditional strikes are the only way we ensure everyone is being brought in. And referring to his economic impacts, again, this is completely disregarding the value of individual justice, giving each person their due. This is about making sure that workers' wants and needs are not being overshadowed. So thus, I urge you to vote on a minimizing structural violence and justice framing. Thank you.
I'd just like to take running prep starting now. All right, end prep time there. For a brief off-time roadmap, I am simply going to go down the negative case defending, go quick over the affirmative case, and then give voters. Is my opponent ready? Is my judge? All right, then with that, let's begin. All right, Judge, first things first in this round is we have to look towards the value criterion debate. Now, again, we have talked over and over again that we agree that we're going for justice. We're going for whoever can bring about what everyone is due. However, my opponent attacks my criterion of telos in the last speech by saying that there is not really a viable way to maximize justice. The point that we have to look at why we're using telos, Judge, is that the whole point of using telos in purpose is seeing what strikes are actually trying to do. Now, my opponent claims that strikes are put in place to help protect these workers' rights. It's meant to increase justice. It's meant to increase human rights. However, if it is doing the exact opposite, if it is harming the economy, if unconditional strikes harm other people's freedoms, then they cannot be upheld. That is the point of this, Judge. It's saying, look towards what it's supposed to do. If it's not doing that, then we shouldn't have it. If it's doing the exact opposite, then why sure we shouldn't have it. That's the whole point of telos, Judge. It's actually showing you that if strikes are actually doing what my opponent is claiming that they should be doing. With that in mind, let's move on to my contention one, talking about each of their due. Now, my opponent claims that it's only in the negative world that we're going to see all these impacts, and that all my evidence I bring up is from the status quo. And that is true because in the status quo, there's both just and unjust things, because we're talking about the entire world. My opponent even brought up China earlier. So it's an unjust situation. And I agree that there could be instances where strikes are useful. Where we disagree, Judge, is the fact of what strikes actually could do for the future. If we have unconditional strikes, it can lead to the furthering of harms. That whole point of the negative side is saying we have to balance people's rights with balance people's rights. You can't put one person's rights over another person's rights. It simply doesn't work. She brings up this idea that we have to think of the workers. Like, why are these hospital workers, why are these educators going on strike in the first place? And I wholeheartedly agree. We should think of the workers. However, we cannot only think of the workers. That is the point here, Judge. The negative is not saying that they cannot go on strike. What we are saying is certain stipulations and certain conditions have to be upheld in order to make sure that the rights of the educated the rights of the students and the rights of the patients aren't harmed in these instances of the others going on strike. Moving on to my subpoint B about the economy. I brought up this idea that this is a global resolution, therefore there's no way to see if governments will follow this. And that is the point of Lincoln-Douglas debate. We're not looking towards policy, we're looking towards a hypothetical worldview. In the world of the negative, we're saying that a just government should not implement unconditional right to strike simply because it can lead to these other harms. Regardless of the fact that strikes can be useful, unconditional is the issue. My opponent, and remember, Judge, this is we're supposed to be looking at hypotheticals. We're supposed to be looking towards what could and could not happen. That's the whole point of Lincoln-Douglas debate. So, moving on to my opponent's case real quick. We can see that my opponent dropped several of my attacks in her last speech. Things such as that the laws and conditions can change, but all we are looking towards is the purpose of this. And things such as the economy can still be promoted and actually help solve for many of these impacts my opponent brings up and actually help promote those. So with that, let's move into the voters in today's debate, Judge. The first voter in today's debate is going to be that of justice. We are talking about what each are due. We agree that we should be promoting human rights. We agree that we should be giving what people are due. We agree that we should be protecting people and minimizing violence and making sure we're achieving that purpose of strikes. However, again, you cannot prioritize one person's rights over another. If you put someone's right to freedom from undue violence ahead of someone's rights from something such as the right to go on strike, you're not giving everyone what they're due. Instead, as my opponent brought up earlier, instead of bringing people out of the margins, you're actually marginalizing those few people. You're actually leading to harming those few people instead, and all in favor of promoting an earlier group. At the end of the day, Judge, you need to see what's actually happening here. Look to healthcare workers, look to educators, look even to violent strikes. If we are leading for causing more harms in the future against these people, regardless of whether or not these workers are being violated, you need to be making sure we're balancing the social interests. You cannot prioritize one over the other. The conditions must be met to maintain the rights of all in the society, not just the workers, not just the greater society. Moving on to the second voter is going to be that of impacts. Now, Judge, in today's debate, we have several impacts, but on the negative, we can see that we actually uphold all people's freedoms. We are not just upholding the one side. We are actually fighting and trying to promote everyone's. We're not harming others. Second off is look to my subpoint B about the economy. We can see that if you have unconditional strikes, that you can lead to further harms in the economy. I brought up the case study of South Africa. How many different strikes without many conditions, unlawful strikes, led to all these harms against the economy, leading to stagflation, unemployment, and poverty. Judge, if you want to actually help people in the margins, then start by the bottom line. Do not allow for things such as poverty and unemployment to keep rising through unconditional strikes. The third and final voter is going to be that of the criterion. Look towards what we're actually fighting for in today's debate, Judge. We are looking towards achieving the purpose of strikes. The purpose of strikes is, as my opponent has brought up in her criterion, is minimizing violence, is increasing human rights. If they don't do that, don't vote for the affirmative. And as you can see throughout my case, they don't uphold everyone's rights. In fact, they can harm some of them. For all these reasons and many more, I urge you to vote for the world of the negative. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to take the rest of my prep. Do I have like a minute? Yeah, I think a little bit less than a minute. Yeah. Okay, I'll like time it for a minute. I'm starting that now.
All right. That should have been time.
Yep. All right, so off time roadmap, I am first going to be beginning on some overalls, like talking about the value, making some clarifications. Then I will be quickly going over my opponent's case, but towards the end, if I have time, I'll do voters. All right, cool. And I will have 3 minutes for that, and I will begin on my first word. So just to clarify, my opponent keeps saying that the purpose of strikes is increasing human rights, but the purpose of strikes is what the workers are striking for, often to achieve some better ends, get better wages, for instance, if they are suppressed and their voices aren't being heard, it's to get better working conditions. We have to value the workers to give each person his or her due. My opponent even kind of, I guess, slipped up and said whether or not the workers are being violated. Exactly. Workers are being violated right now. Workers' rights and their justices are not being given to them. And the only way that they can achieve this is through striking, as the affirmative has honestly proved too. We are not using a util calculus here. We are both valuing justice. You can't simply look only to the economic impacts and the impacts on other people when you're valuing justice. You need to look to what are the conditions that each individual is going through. And again, it's not an individual worker. It is thousands and thousands of striking workers that are subject to unfair wages, unfair working conditions, potentially dangerous and deadly situations that they have no other way of getting out of. And by putting conditions onto these workers of when they can or cannot strike, you are disincentivizing strikes. That point goes unrefuted. You are actively making sure that those who are whose voices are minimized in some way or structurally oppressed are not being included in the voting body. And you have to value minimizing structural violence for the round, because no other framing, including my opponent's case, accounts for the outgroup. There is no moral inclusion of the people that are being oppressed in my opponent's case. So the only way to achieve true justice, giving each person his or her due, means that we have to make public policy decisions that are going to bring this outgroup in, which I do throughout my case. I'll circle back to that, but again, with my opponents, all of the impacts that my opponent is accessing are still going to exist in the neg world. And again, he provides no evidence to show that they were going to persist in any greater significance or to any greater extent in the affirmative world. There is no actual evidence to show this other than a simple claim. We can't simply extrapolate that workers are just going to start striking anytime they want to. Again, when you strike, it is for a purpose, and it's also recognized as a sort of last resort. Workers are relying on these jobs for their very living. Then circling back to my own case, in my first contention, talking about how conditions disincentivize strikes, so the recognition of unconditional striking is essential, especially in today's political climate and in today's current climate. We can see through that Visor 19 card that I brought up that you must vote in the affirmative because unions are currently declining. The current way that we are going about doing things is causing a decline in unions, and we're not seeing an uplifting of voices. And we can even see the UK, which banned secondary strikes. These are all conditions. None of the things that happened in that UK secondary strike were violent, illegal, harmed workers or harmed education. It was showing sympathy for another strike. However, these strikers are not allowed to strike under the conditions stipulated. And in my second intention, talking about uplifting Black workers, it is the only way that we can bring in their voices and allow them to have the same considerations as everyone else. And it also pushes against class discrimination. So I urge you to vote in the affirmative. Thank you. Thank you, Judge. Thank you, opponent.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good round.
Good round. Do you disclose? I'm not totally sure.
Okay. Is it required in this tournament for everyone to disclose?
It is not.
I
It is
don't think so. I know that my last judge did, but he also wasn't sure if it was required or not. So
Okay. So if you give me a second, I can disclose winner and then the initial reasoning behind that. So I do need a minute if you want to stick around and find out who won.
All right.
thank you.
All right, so I've made a decision. First off, I'm going to say I have heard this topic debated before, and this is by far the best round and both side arguments that I have heard yet on this topic. So you both should be very proud in what you have achieved during this round. In terms of making this short, sweet, to the point so that you can go and get some lunch before your next round, I am going to vote with the affirmative side. In this case, I really felt that the